Used as a bargaining chip, my fiancé's threat to my brother, yet he never looked at me. Chapter 1: The Unseen Sacrifice. I never imagined that I would become a pawn in a cruel game. My fiancé, Ethan, whom I once loved, became the weapon my brother, Caleb, would use to force a reunion with his estranged lover, Vanessa. It started with subtle arguments, and then, one evening, it escalated into something much darker. Ethan barged into my home, his eyes wild with desperation. He grabbed me by the arm, dragged me to the center of the living room, and then pulled a knife from his pocket. His voice was calm, eerily so, as he pressed the cold steel against my throat. "Bring her back," he ordered, his voice a sharp contrast to the rage in his eyes. "Or you'll be collecting your sister's corpse." I could feel the tension in the room, the weight of his words sinking into my chest. I looked to Caleb, my brother, hoping for a flicker of concern. But he didn't even glance at me. He simply stood there, unmoved. His gaze was fixed on Ethan, his lips barely moving as he spoke, "Oh." It was a moment that should have been filled with desperation, but instead, it was filled with apathy. Caleb didn't care. And that realization hit me harder than anything else could. I felt like I was drowning in the suffocating silence of that moment. Ethan's grip tightened, the blade digging into my skin as if to reinforce his demand. I was nothing more than a tool in this twisted negotiation between two men I once thought I knew. But Caleb, the one person I thought would fight for me, didn't even flinch. "Then go ahead and kill her," he said without emotion, his voice distant. His words were like a dagger to my heart, each syllable confirming the painful truth that my life had no value to him anymore. I was just a means to an end, a pawn in their game. The knife pressed harder into my throat, but my world was already unraveling. My depression, something I had quietly battled for years, surged to the surface with a force I couldn't control. I felt my body tremble, a mixture of anger, despair, and hopelessness consuming me. In a moment of uncontrollable rage and pain, I thrust myself toward the blade, hoping for an end. The world around me blurred as everything faded to black, and for a brief moment, I thought it was over. Chapter 2: Death's Embrace. I woke up to a world that felt strangely empty, the silence deafening. The room was cold, the harshness of reality setting in as I realized that I had crossed over into a new existence, one where I no longer had a place, a purpose, or a family who cared. My death, though painful and sudden, had not only taken my life but had shattered something far more significant. I could feel it, the darkness of my mind expanding into every corner of my being. I was dead, but my soul, it seemed, was cursed to linger. Ethan, who had once promised to love me, had used me as a tool. Caleb, my brother, had never cared enough to fight for me, not even when my life was on the line. In the afterlife, I was left with nothing but my pain and my anger, a rage that consumed me from the inside out. I had given everything, my love, my loyalty, and my trust. But they had taken it all, leaving me empty. And now, as I wandered through this cold, desolate place, I could feel something shifting. There was a sharp awareness growing within me. I wasn't meant to just fade into oblivion. I would not allow them to escape without feeling the consequences of their actions. My death, though tragic, had become the spark of something far greater. Something darker. And just as the realization of my new existence hit me, I felt it, a pull, a deep, unsettling pull that tugged at my very being. It wasn't just my consciousness lingering. It was something more, something powerful, something vengeful. I had been used, betrayed, and cast aside, but I wouldn't allow them to forget me. I had to make them see, to make them regret their decisions. I had died for nothing, but now I would haunt their lives, an unstoppable force driving them to madness. The world they had built on my brokenness would crumble. I would not rest until my brother and my fiancé knew the true cost of their cruelty. The torment they had inflicted upon me was not something I would forgive easily. My soul, though shattered, was more powerful than they could imagine. And in that darkness, I found my purpose, to make them pay. Chapter 3, A World Unraveled. Ethan and Caleb went on with their lives, unaffected by the storm they had unleashed. The very people who had once been so important to me continued with their day-to-day existence, as if my death meant nothing. Ethan, who had orchestrated my end, had his life, and Caleb, who had ignored my pleas for help, carried on as if I had never existed. But I watched them, unseen, unheard, as they continued their selfish, self-centered lives. And then, the changes began. It started small at first, Ethan's anxiety, his inability to sleep, his growing paranoia. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his breath ragged as though something were closing in on him. He began to lose weight, his once commanding presence turning into a shell of his former self. Caleb, too, was not spared. The cold indifference he had shown me began to fade, replaced by a hollow emptiness that was unmistakable. The guilt, the haunting realization that he had never cared, began to consume him. The more I watched them, the more I realized the depth of their insanity. They had taken everything from me, but now, in their quest for power and control, they were losing themselves. They had thought my death would be the end, but it was only the beginning. Ethan's every step was followed by a growing dread, a fear that his past sins were catching up with him. Caleb, the man who had once been my brother, was unraveling, the cracks in his facade growing larger with each passing day. As I lingered in this new existence, I could feel the pressure mounting. They had thought they were the ones in control, but they were about to learn that my death was only the first step in their undoing. The world they had built on manipulation and cruelty would crumble beneath the weight of their guilt and remorse. I would not rest until they faced the consequences of their actions. Chapter 4, The Reckoning. The madness that Ethan and Caleb had been avoiding was finally here. Every action they took, every decision they made, led them further down a path of destruction. Ethan's once confident demeanor faltered as the weight of his actions began to crush him. He became a shadow of the man he had once been, constantly looking over his shoulder, haunted by the memory of my blood-stained death. Caleb, too, could no longer ignore the truth. The guilt he had buried deep inside him bubbled to the surface, leaving him a broken man, unable to function as he once had. And as they spiraled into chaos, they began to realize the truth: they had not killed me. I was not gone. I was here, in the shadows, watching them suffer. The very thing they had sought to escape had come back to haunt them in ways they could never have imagined. The terror they felt was not just fear of the past, but fear of something far more sinister, the consequences of their cruelty. The reckoning had come, and it was only a matter of time before their lives were torn apart. There was no escape from the path they had set me on. I would ensure that they faced the consequences, no matter how far they tried to run. The darkness that had consumed me would now consume them, and they would learn what it meant to truly regret their actions. As the final pieces of their lives began to fall apart, I knew this was only the beginning. The torment I had suffered had forged me into something stronger. And now, they would feel every ounce of pain they had inflicted upon me. It was time for them to pay the price. Chapter 5, The Fractured Mind. As Ethan and Caleb spiraled into madness, the truth they had spent so long avoiding slowly began to seep into their consciousness. They could feel the presence of something unseen, something watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The guilt gnawed at them, every waking moment a reminder of their cruelty. Ethan, in particular, seemed to be losing his grip on reality. His once sharp mind had become clouded with paranoia. He would look into mirrors only to see my reflection staring back at him, my eyes hollow and accusing. The walls of his apartment seemed to close in around him, the silence unbearable, filled with the echoes of my final moments. It wasn't just the fear of being haunted by my spirit, but the overwhelming regret that he had never truly loved me, that I had been nothing more than a pawn in his game. The terror he felt was consuming him, and in his desperation, he began searching for any way to undo what had been done, to somehow bring me back to life. Caleb, too, was trapped in his own web of regret. His indifference toward me in my final moments weighed heavily on him, and it showed. He became distant from everyone, even Vanessa, the woman he had fought so hard to bring back into his life. Every time he looked at her, all he could see was my empty eyes, the look of betrayal that had been etched into my face. He couldn't escape the thought that he had killed me with his inaction, that his failure to protect me had led to my death. But it wasn't just their emotions that were beginning to unravel. The very fabric of their lives was starting to tear apart. Ethan's career, which had once been on an upward trajectory, now seemed to falter. Deals he once closed with ease now slipped through his fingers. Caleb's relationships, both personal and professional, started to break down. The people who once admired him began to distance themselves, sensing the darkness that now clung to him. The reckoning I had promised was slowly unfolding. Chapter 6, The Beginning of the End. It wasn't just the guilt that was destroying them, it was the mounting pressure, the sense of inevitability. They both knew, deep down, that I was still here. In the nights, when the house was quiet, they could hear my voice in the whispers of the wind, my name echoing through their minds like a mantra. It wasn't just in their minds, though. The world around them began to turn against them, reflecting their internal chaos. Strange things started happening, objects would move on their own, whispers would fill the silence, and shadows seemed to follow them wherever they went. It was as if the universe itself was conspiring against them, punishing them for the life they had taken. Their fear only deepened with every passing day, and the more they tried to push me out of their minds, the more I lingered. But my vengeance wasn't only a matter of fear, it was a matter of justice. They had wronged me, and I would not let them walk free. Each of their actions was now met with consequences. Every step they took toward a normal life felt like a step deeper into a trap. As their lives continued to disintegrate, Caleb sought solace in the one person he had always turned to, Vanessa. But even she began to withdraw from him. The once passionate love between them had turned cold, like everything else in his life. Vanessa began to question the sincerity of Caleb's feelings, sensing that something had shifted within him. She knew he was haunted, but she didn't understand why. The cracks in their relationship deepened as Caleb, unable to escape his own self-loathing, withdrew further into himself. And then, one day, he looked in the mirror. What he saw staring back at him wasn't his reflection, but mine. My eyes, bloodshot and hollow, were fixed on him, accusing him of his betrayal. His heart raced in his chest as he reached out to touch the mirror, his hand trembling. The moment his fingers brushed against the cold glass, it shattered. And as the shards fell to the floor, he knew that the final barrier between him and the reckoning had broken. There was no escaping the consequences now. Chapter 7, The Haunting Returns. As the days dragged on, Ethan and Caleb found themselves caught in a cycle they couldn't escape. They both knew, on some level, that their lives had been irrevocably altered. There was no going back from what had happened. The fear they felt was no longer just fear of me, it was fear of what they had become. They had killed the part of themselves that could feel empathy, that could love. And in its place was a darkness that seemed to consume everything they touched. Caleb, in particular, began to lose touch with reality. He would stand by the window, staring out into the night, and then suddenly lash out at the empty space around him, as if something, or someone, was there with him. He had seen the signs for a long time now, but it was only now, when everything around him began to fall apart, that he understood the true depth of his punishment. The life he had once built, the one he had taken for granted, was crumbling to dust. The guilt gnawed at him, and he couldn't escape it. Ethan wasn't doing much better. He had taken to wandering the city at night, hoping to escape the weight of my death, the guilt that had become his constant companion. But everywhere he went, he saw reminders of me. In the faces of strangers, in the shadows of alleyways, in the reflection of a passing car, I was there. He couldn't escape me. The more he tried to run from his past, the more it consumed him. And as the days turned into weeks, he started to hear my voice again, louder and clearer each time. One night, as he sat in his office, staring at the papers in front of him, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, expecting to see a colleague or a friend. But no one was there. The lights flickered above him, and then, for a brief moment, everything went black. When the lights came back on, there, standing in front of him, was my ghostly figure, my face expressionless, my eyes cold and unforgiving. "Do you know what you've done?" I whispered, my voice soft but cutting through the silence like a blade. Chapter 8, The Final Collapse. It wasn't just their lives that were falling apart, it was their minds. Caleb and Ethan had both become unrecognizable versions of themselves, trapped in a cycle of guilt, fear, and despair. Every moment was a reminder of their failure to protect me, to love me. Their sanity began to slip away, piece by piece. Caleb's world had become a blur of confusion and isolation. He no longer knew who he was or what he stood for. Vanessa, once the love of his life, now seemed like a distant memory. He couldn't bear to be around her anymore, as every time he saw her, he saw my face instead. Ethan, too, was breaking down. He had tried everything to avoid the consequences of his actions. He visited spiritual leaders, tried to appease the guilt with lavish gifts, and buried himself in work, but nothing worked. The pain, the shame, and the terror followed him everywhere. He would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, convinced that I was standing over him, watching him, waiting for him to atone for what he had done. And then, one day, it happened. Both Ethan and Caleb stood at the precipice, their lives in ruins. They had lost everything, everything that had once defined them. They had destroyed me, and in doing so, they had destroyed themselves. It was at this moment that they realized the truth: they had never truly loved me. They had only loved the idea of me, the perfect image they had created in their minds. But now, with that image shattered, they were left with nothing but the cold, hard reality of their actions. The final collapse was inevitable. They had no way of escaping the consequences of their cruelty. The lives they had once built were now gone, consumed by their own guilt and remorse. And as the darkness closed in around them, they knew that they had paid the ultimate price. There was no redemption. There was only the endless echo of my death, a reminder of the pain they had caused, and the lives they had destroyed. The end.